Hi, everyone. It's Antonio Galoni. Welcome to Vinous Live. We have an incredible week set up for you guys. It's going to be very entertaining and interactive as always. My guest today is Thomas Rivers Brown. Thomas, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. We've got a lot to talk about. And, we've put together this series of seminars to bring people together. I think right now everybody's got a kind of an upended schedule. It's hard to know what day of the week it is. And hopefully the idea with Vinous Live is that it can help bring us together a little bit more and help us communicate during this time. That's a time of a lot of upheaval and uncertainty. Our goal is to make these seminars as interactive as possible. So what we'd really like is for you to start giving us your questions right away. That way we can weave them into the conversation. Sometimes if we get them all at the end, it's really hard to answer them all. And with somebody like Thomas, I mean, we could be here for 3 hours, but you have work to do. So do that. But if we can get some questions now, that'll really help us frame the discussion. So before we we've got some wines to taste, it's going to be fantastic. But before we get into that, I'm just curious, you're from South Carolina originally, right? Thomas?
Yeah, the whole family's been there for 300 years.
Jesus. So how do you end up in Napa Valley?
I went to college in Virginia. I got out of South Carolina as soon as I could. I'd never really been anywhere. So went to the University of Virginia, and while I was there, had a girlfriend whose family was into wine as a consumer, and became really good friends with the family. Dated her just long enough where they had to start giving me Christmas gifts. And I think as soon as they realized I had even the slightest bit of interest in wine, the Christmas gifts became all about wine. And I became fascinated by the idea that you could never know everything about this. And so there was some intellectual curiosity that kicked in. So pursued it after University of Virginia by working in a series of restaurants in Richmond, Virginia, all the while with an eye sort of on Napa. I don't think I knew of any other place to go, to be honest with you, because I mean, it's sort of the benchmark still. And so the idea was just to get out there. Had some friends from University of Virginia who moved out to the Bay Area. They were in a band and they were going to go to the Bay Area and make it big. The band was not great, even though the people were very great. And so I had a place to crash when I moved out to Oakland first. I ended up sleeping in a friend's closet, and they charged me $50 a month. We put a sheet in between the closet and the bedroom, and I paid my full share of utilities, but crashed there for 3 months after driving out from Richmond, and just started popping up to Napa, knocking on doors. And I had about 8 part-time jobs for a year or two before things started falling into place in Napa.
Okay. And your first job that wasn't one of those 8, that was like a steady job, was which one?
Well, so All Season Wine Shop, which is probably a sub place you've heard of, was kind of the barometer for places to go and buy wines and hang out and learn about wines in the Valley. John Wetlaufer was one of the original buyers there, Helen Turley's husband, and a series of great buyers came through there. It was a tiny little shop, but just amazing selection of wines. And so All Seasons is where I really got exposed to the Valley, to all the people in the Valley. We used to do a Friday evening tasting where we'd open 3 wines and charge people $5. And one of the guys who came often was Aaron Jordan, who was at Turley at the time. And so I worked harvest at a little place called Kent Rasmussen on Silverado Trail. And I was talking to Aaron. He's like, hey, looking for my first ever, I guess you call it, assistant winemaker. 97 was a huge vintage at Turley, and it was pretty intense, and I need some help. So I was like, okay, no problem. Let me get you my resume and let's get started. So I was the first resume that came in, but he didn't hire me right away. A couple more 100 resumes came in. I got to meet Aaron and Larry a few times, and I jumped in there December of 97, and that's really where it all started for me.
Okay. And then after that?
Was at Turley through February of 01, and Aaron was starting to do a little consulting. He was making a little bit of wine for a little place called Outpost. That's sort of where it started. And the Pringles, who owned it at the time, Aaron had known since he'd worked at Phelps. And so he started that project up on the hill where you visited. And we also were buying fruit from the Pringles for our Turley bottling. Aaron was getting pretty busy. Turley was definitely blowing up. It was a very unique business. For all the cults of that time, it was kind of the only non-cab cult wine, especially for red wine. And so it was going bigger, bigger, bigger. Larry and Aaron were finding a bunch of cool vineyards. I think what happened was Larry said, look, I need your full attention. You already have a couple other things that I know you own or really invested in, like Nyers and and Phala, all these other things I would like for you to give up. And so Aaron's natural course was to pass them off to me. I remember those very awkward conversations with those first few clients who were pretty unconvinced that I was the right person to take these over. But thank God they had faith in me. I picked up a couple clients, the first three being Chiarello, Outpost, and Schrader. And I woke up one morning and realized I was making 3 times the money consulting as I was working 4 times as much at Turley. So in February of 01, sort of took off on my own to start consulting. And then along the way, very quickly picked up a couple projects. And then over the years, have sort of added, 2 or 3 projects a year on average.
Yeah. And I met you in 2008, I think, at La Pole at a Soldera lunch at RN in San Francisco.
That was one of the times. I think that we maybe had met a little bit before that through a mutual friend of ours, James Johnson.
Yeah, we might have met before then. Yeah.
And a lot of it had to do, it was kind of centered around the Piedmont report. I mentioned to you, I have some props and I'm not tipping my hand, but some of those early Piedmont reports were pretty big deals for me as I was first jumping into Barbaresque and Barolo.
Right. So you're known, obviously you've got this incredible roster of consulting clients, and then you have the wines that you make with Geneviève, your wife. We'll talk about those also. But what are some of the things that formed your winemaking approach, your influences, your early influences in wine beyond Napa?
Well, I think growing up on the East Coast, as you did as well, when you first get exposed to wine, most of what you get exposed to is European wine. And so I jumped in sort of with both feet into anything and everything someone would open for me. And of course, when you start as well, you don't have any money. So you're basically relying on the kindness of strangers. And the way you pry the corks out of the other people's bottles is to show a lot of enthusiasm, I think, to try these wines. And so you start in certain areas that I think at first are just presented to you. Then you figure out what you like, and then you pursue those additional areas. And for sure, places like the Southern Rhone, Piedmont, Champagne, Burgundy, of course, all of those things were kind of my first forays into wine. And people, it's a bad joke, but like people always say, how can I learn about wine? Literally the way you learn about it is to taste everything that someone will put in front of you. And for me, that was at All Seasons, the place I mentioned before, with all the wine reps that would come in. I think a lot of times if you're a seasoned wine buyer and a rep shows up unannounced, you're like, please leave and don't ever call me again. How dare you? And for me, being a young, like 23-year-old kid who just moved out here, I'm like, I'll taste whatever you got. And so tasting a ton of wines is what sort of exposed me to all the different regions of the world. And then from there, I've sort of zeroed in on the things that I really enjoy drinking.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned All Seasons, because for a lot of people of our generation, that was a very important learning place. I mean, in talking with a lot of winemakers more or less of our age, a lot of them will mention All Seasons as a place where they first tasted really great wines from the place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a generation of folks out there, winemakers that are kind of my same age, and someone who beat me here by a little bit, Tony Biaggi, who Tony worked, I think, at St. Helena Wine Center, and that was another spot. They're sort of famous. They got a massive allocation of the first couple of vintages of Screaming Eagle, and they like floor stacked it. And I can't remember the price. Tony remembers it. But I mean, those were the days the stuff was accessible. Like if you really wanted a bottle of Colgan or Raho or Harlan or Screaming Eagle, if you tried hard enough, you could find it, and you could probably afford it too. So it was a really fun time to be here as all these different small wineries exploded onto the scene.
Yeah, like Jocosa Red Labels once upon a time.
Yes, I was reading about those in the second issue of the Piedmont report. They seemed very accessible back then.
Well, it's good. I mean, that is kind of, we're joking, but I mean, obviously it's great if you had a chance to taste those first vintages of Screaming Eagle or vintages of Monfortino or whatever before these wines became really widely recognized. But it obviously is a challenge for the next generation of folks that, obviously the prices of those wines make it difficult for people to have a grounding. I mean, those wines are a foundation,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's incumbent upon folks who have the means or the cellar or the, experience or whatever to open those for the next generation, because you're right. I mean, I just ran into a couple more bottles of 71 Giacosa Roque, and like I'm now at the point where I'm buying stuff with no vintage date and just trusting the person who's buying it and paying way too much for it. But I as much as I'd love to drink that by myself in a dark room, I definitely want to take those bottles out and crack them for some folks who have no access to wines like that.
Yeah.
And I feel that way about everything we collect at this point.
Well, I think it's one of the great things of wine. One of the great things about wine is that it does engender and inspire that kind of generosity. And that for sure, that's how I learned. You mentioned somebody before, James Johnson. This was one of my very first subscribers to Piedmont Report. I mean, like really, really very first people who sent me a note. So this would have been in 2004 or so, and said, "Hey, I'd like to give a bunch of my friends in the Valley a subscription. Can I buy like 10 of these?" And I was like, "Yeah, can I have as many as you want?"
One of those people was me.
He gave them to you, to Tony, to
yeah.
That was kind of funny, but that's and he's the kind of guy who would always open Rousseau or Dujac or Giacosa or whatever you want, you know.
It was absolutely. And James has been one of my greatest sort of benefactors. I mean, he's just, like you said, you go in the cellar and you show interest in something, James is happy to crack it for you and talk about it. And it's just fun sometimes to run into someone that you just wine geek out and nothing else really matters. And the amount of bottles that I've had with him that I'll never be able to see again or maybe even replace, just stunning.
Yeah, because those wines they are pretty much irreplaceable. So what are some of the things that you've had lately that have inspired you?
So we really whittled it down because for a little while the cellar got a little out of hand. So now I'm trying to focus in on a couple different areas that I really, really like. And things sort of come and go. I think you and I have talked about my infatuation with champagne for a long time. And I just continue to be just amazed by Anselm Solosa's wines. I mean, I can't buy enough or drink enough of those wines. They're just such iconoclast wines, and there's just nothing else out there like them. And then also something that I loved early on, but then put away for a while, were Southern Rhone wines. I know Bob Parker had a huge affinity, obviously, for that area. And so following Bob, I'll never forget one of his articles. It said, you know, the world's most delicious wines. And it's 100% true. Those are wines occasionally for me. I wish they didn't have alcohol so I could drink a lot more of them in one sitting. I got a little overwhelmed by their bigness or their alcohol at one point, and I just put them away. We didn't get rid of them. And now Genevieve and I are kind of revisiting them at 10, 12, 15 years old, and the wines are just phenomenal. Yeah. So really enjoying these wines with a little bit of age that are getting really savory and really interesting and really broad. And then of course, white and red Burgundies, as much as I can, I'm chasing down stuff that's older, that's been well cellared. I'm not William Kelly, so I don't quite have that access, but I'm trying. I'm at least friends with William, so I get to follow him on Instagram and watch all the crazy stuff he's drinking.
Yeah, that's
but there's just a handful of regions that's usually where the focus has been lying for us.
Yeah, that's cool. Any particular wines stand out? Particular specific wine that you've had recently that's just been tremendous?
Well, so I mean, I'm just as guilty as everyone else of hearing about these things and then chasing them down. And some things are amazing, some things aren't. But I've been drinking a lot of Boisson Badeau Gimbrière bottlings and a lot of the Hubert Lamy high density bottlings for Whitebergs, especially as the weather has warmed up out here. I think we're gravitating towards more white wine. And those wines are just stunning. And last night I had the 11 Boisson Badeau, just the Grand Chiron bottling. And that style of white Burgundy with that perfect balance of, you know, acid fruit and reduction is just what I'm sort of chasing right now. And it's definitely what I'm sort of chasing in the way we make Chardonnays for ourselves and for other people.
Mm. Well, do you want to share any of those props you have before we talk about your wines?
Well, I mean, I think one of the coolest parts about the prop, and you won't think it's boring, but I mean, this is the copy of what James Johnson had first sort of given me. And it is issue number 1, which I think you can see. And the cool part about that, the convergence of everything, is this is also like too. There's the young Antonio is right as I developed a real passion for these wines. The Piedmont Report started coming out, and 99 and 01 was the first vintages I really bought in quantity, probably because I could afford them. They were still available. A good friend of you and I's as well, Manny Burke, was a great outlet in our area of Northern California for these wines. was very generous about sharing them, also very generous about selling them. And so that sort of convergence of the Piedmont report, those wines coming into my purview, and the affordability of them in a relative sense was just a great combination of things. And it's been fun to go with time to read, go back and read the Piedmont report and your initial impressions of these wines. Not that they're mature, but it's been really fun with them being 20 years old to see what the notes look like versus what the wines taste like now.
Are they mostly accurate or what?
They're mostly accurate. You also have time on your side. I mean, you're 2 decades removed from, tasting some of these wines in the Piedmont report. So it's been fun to sort of go back and look at these, not only as great things to enjoy, but also historical artifacts.
Yeah. So that was a time, 99 is the vintage that came out right after 9/11. And those wines they sat around for a long time, and they were affordable, and not just affordable, but you could buy some volume of them, which is the other issue today, is not just where the prices are, but the allocations or the availability of these wines has really narrowed as the interest has exploded. But back then you could buy basically whatever you wanted of any of those wines, quantity wise, assuming you could pay for it. Obviously that's a big change. So
yes, that is a huge change. Now, I'm trying to hunt down 13 Monfortino, and I'm willing to pay $3,000 a 3-pack for it. That's a very different set of parameters.
Well, there's a question here about your wines, but I think it's going to apply to that wine and a lot of other wines, which is to say that the on-premise channel, which is the channel of selling wines into restaurants, has basically gone to zero right now because of COVID. And that means that I think a lot of these wines, I don't think the prices are going to come down necessarily, but I think it'll be easier to buy. Maybe not that wine because it was released last year, but I think it's going to be easier to buy certain wines now because for retail customers and collectors, because the restaurant channel where a lot of those wines are usually directed to doesn't really exist right now, unfortunately, for the people who work in that industry, which is really very sad. But obviously that wine has to be bought by somebody, and I think it will be available. So,
yeah, I think, I think once things start to sort of really shake out, and there's also wines like that maybe they're not the world's greatest restaurant wines. They're going to pop up on a list for $2,500 and they're not ready for 40 years. I think there's a lot of things that are getting priced in a way, unintentionally, of course, that lead them away from being restaurant wines. There's very few restaurants that could take that wine and throw it in the cellar for 20 years. So I think there will be a move towards less expensive wines on lists, and you have your true collectibles, mostly passing hands, at high-end retail shops or via mailing lists.
Yeah. I think it's cool that because I think wine is a passion, but it's not always a passion for everybody. And I think that when you're tasting wine from all over the world, that obviously and those are all influences that are going to come out in the wines that you make. And so I remember the first time I went out to Outpost, it might not have been the first time we met, but the first time I went out to Outpost was in 2008. It was that year of La Palais. There was that Soldera lunch. And then a couple of days later, I went out to Outpost. I remember that was the first vintage I tasted at Rivers Marie. So it would have been 2007, but I'm pretty sure that wine was, it was in March. So it wasn't in the bottle. It was in barrel, but we tasted a bunch of 07s in barrel. But what was the genesis of starting that label?
So Rivers Marie actually started in 2002, and it started with Scott Zeller, who was the original owner of Suma Vineyard. I'd met him while I was at Turley because Aaron got half a ton of Suma one year randomly. I don't think that's a story I'm supposed to tell, but it's been so long, I don't think it matters. But Scott and I kind of struck up a friendship when we were out looking for some fruit, potentially to start something, or just seeing what was available. I'd known Scott for 3 years at that point, and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in a little bit of Suma?" My contract with, I think it was Mueller Winery at the time, had broken, and we're looking to replace him with a few different people. We've got a new block coming online, all this other stuff. So of course I said yes, and I certainly did not have the money to pay for any of this stuff, but I sort of figured it out. And 02, which we just had the other day, made 44 cases of the old vine and 88 cases of the regular Suma. And I think that was the first crop for the regular Suma block. And that's where it started. And then instead of, we were lucky enough to get some good scores early, some good press, some good other things. Alan Meadows had some really nice things to say about the 04 Old Vines, a few things like that. And so demand started to ratchet up. The best thing we ever did was not go out and source fruit just to meet demand. So what we've done over the course of the, project's almost 20 years is as we found things we really loved, we've grabbed them sort of slowly and built the brand really slowly. And that is across Pinot, Cabernet, and Chardonnay for us.
So Suma is a very interesting vineyard on Baker Lane, correct?
Taylor Lane.
Taylor Lane. And from there, you can see part of Theriot. I'm not sure what the right pronunciation is.
Yep.
But the really cool district. And the young vines, as I remember, it's an old vineyard, of course, so the vineyards are very low density. And the young vines are interplanted, right? Which you don't see, is pretty uncommon to see the young vines are rows in between the old vines, correct?
There's three blocks. The youngest block are the interplanted rows. And the reason that was possible out there, of course, was the vineyard was originally planted 8 by 12. So meaning there were 12 feet between the rows.
Yeah.
So you could drive a car in between the rows for a while.
What's the clonal material there?
We don't really know. The owners didn't tell us. And my gut instinct is when you have something great, you tell everybody. And when you have something terrible, you don't tell anyone. So I don't know that I want to know. We've had some people who've tasted the wines, people who are way smarter than me, who think it reminds them a little bit of Swan, especially the old vine bottling. So I'm just going to say Swan because I love that clone. And that's sort of a best case scenario for what's out there.
Yeah, so for folks watching who don't know, Swan is a heritage California clone that's known for being very perfumey. And one of the things about the Suma Old Vines is it's always a very delicate wine. It's not, I think sometimes the tendency is to think Old Vines, it's a really powerful wine, but it's really not. It's always very lifted and elegant. And you don't do a lot with whole clusters, correct?
Very little. We actually do it sort of opposite, I think, to what most people think of. We use it on the riper sites to kind of cut into the candied middle palate that some of those wines can possess. So one of the wines we'll taste today, the Occidental Ridge, we started using a little bit of whole cluster in that wine in 12. And it's only about 10%. And what it does is it just adds a texture, an aromatic, and a little bit of scratchiness to the texture that we really like it.
Yeah, so there's 3 wines. I mean, we're going to start taking questions here in a second because there's a ton and it's fantastic. But we wanted to sort of talk about 3 wines. This is actually your idea, but to talk about 3 wines that are vineyards that are about 2 miles from each other, which is amazing to think that the wines could be so different. A lot of it has to do with obviously the age of the vineyard and clones and stuff. But this is the Suma Old Vines, which is the first wine that we're talking about. And it is always very perfumey and very delicate, and wouldn't surprise me at all if it's Swan or something like that, because it is very lifted and very red fruit always. And
yeah, almost like a red orange fruit. There's something really unique about Suma. Of all the wines that we make, whether it be Pinot, Chard, Cab, for ourselves, for other clients too, there's something about the Suma aromatic that's just so unique. It's one of the few wines I could easily pick out of a blind lineup.
And then what's particular about Occidental Ridge?
So the interesting part there was planted in 98, and it's a vineyard that I split with Aaron for Fela, and he beat me there by a day. So he gets 2/3 of it. Now I get 1/3. It's Dijon clone. Again, it's one of those sites that if you and I walked it, you wouldn't think, wow, this is going to be something unique. This is something that could be a benchmark for a program. And that doesn't make it unique either. There's a lot of vineyards like that. But then we started making it, and it has the lowest natural pH of all the wines we make for Pinot. Has this crazy sort of pennyroyal mint aromatic that makes it very distinctive. And there's probably the highest amount of fruit tannin for all the vineyards that we deal with too, or at least until Platt came along. And it's just unique, exotic, just old enough to have, this nice weightiness without being heavy. But a vineyard that we definitely were surprised by the quality when we first started out there.
Yeah, this one definitely has a darker profile and more gravitas, more weight in the middle. This vintage, I mean, these, so you bottled these wines when, in December?
We bottled these wines in August. We bottled Pinot really early.
Very early. Okay. Yes. And I tasted them in January. This is a magical vintage. not just for Pinot Noir, but I mean, we had Morgan Peterson on here a couple weeks ago. We were tasting Sonoma Valley wines, but his wines from the Russian River from Sonoma Valley are beautiful. Carlisle, Hartford, Zinfandel's 18 is just a beautiful vintage. Tell us a little bit about what makes that vintage so special.
I think out there, the main issue, and I'm sure Mike and Morgan will probably agree with this too, because they're dealing with thin skin varietals for the most part as well. You just need to stay away from any kind of intense heat when you're talking about coastal vineyards or other thin skin varietals. And in 18, we had a combination of no crazy heat. And then also a decent sized crop. Like people always think, oh, wow, low yield must be amazing. Well, there's certain years where there's so little fruit, you literally can't hold it on the vine because there's so little for the vine to do. Sugar accumulation and all these other things are moving at a really rapid pace. And the ripeness in terms of sugar anyway is getting away from you relative to true ripeness. And in 18, there was just great balance across the board. There was no weird weather at the end. So literally you had this massive sort of pick window to grab it exactly when you thought it was ready. So we were able to just kind of slow roll it, taste it, think about it, taste it, think about it. And there were no kind of these, oh crap moments where 1,000-degree weekend is coming up the third weekend in September and you just have to pull everything off. So you think about an early bud break and then a late harvest and then a big enough crop to support it. And also for us, to be honest with you, at Suma, for instance, there are years where it sets half a ton an acre. You don't feel really good about going out there and doing an aggressive fruit drop, even if it needs it. 18 with the crop load, we felt fine being very selective because we knew we could be selective and still, be economically viable. And so we had this massive hang time, decent sized crop and no crazy weather. I mean, we always talk about the vintages we love and the vintages that produce the best wines are the vintages we don't remember because the trauma of, the fire season or 15 with the intense heat or 11 with botrytis and rain, those are the things that stick in your brain. Vintages like 16 and 18, if you ask me about the growing season, I don't remember that much about it, which is always a good sign.
Yeah, it must be really hard to make wine because, I think for a lot of people, the emotional stress of difficult events in the vineyard is impossible to separate from the wine until many years pass by. But it's something I've noticed sort of all over the world, that people have it must be very hard. You're at the whims of nature and you can't do anything about rot in 11 or rain during the harvest. And so I remember this in 08 in Burgundy, that producers hated those wines because they struggled so much. And then a few years later, when the wines started to come together, they're like, oh, this is a great vintage. Yeah. But at the time, people were really marked by the stress of the year, emotional stress.
Oh yeah, no, it gets on top of you. And then you have a year like 19, really good year. But then every 2 weeks, they turn the power off for 4 days. So another unique challenge is not even, well, it's weather related sort of, but it's a brand new thing for us. And you're just playing defense constantly.
Yeah. So 19 last year for people watching who don't know, and I torment these winemakers in Napa Valley every year by tasting in the middle of the harvest, but basically the harvest dates were changing like from day to day. And the power was like, is it going to come on? Is it going to come off? And, you can't harvest when there's no power because you can't sort. And you'd be surprised how many big wineries didn't have generators. And so you've got fruit hanging out there. You've got tourists staying in $1,000 a night hotels without power. The city of Napa, the lines around the gas station, the drugstores are empty with shelves. I mean, unfortunately, this year we've seen more of that. But I mean, back then it was kind of a shock to see that. Yeah. And in the middle of that, you're trying to make wine.
No, yeah, and it's unique to the situation. We're used to dealing with rain or humidity or heat or cold or whatever. And now you throw, planned power outages and homeschooling and all these other amazing things into the mix. And now we're all becoming school teachers and, meteorologists and virus experts. And I mean, it's just amazing, the amalgam of challenges. Some of us sort of like it. And then there's other people, of course, that want to lock themselves in a closet and come out 2 months later.
It's tough. I'm learning a lot about math.
Yes. 6th grade math for me, which is pushing my upper limits.
4th for me, and the result is the same. All right. Yeah. Then we're going to talk about what makes these wines different. But the Plat is a really special wine. To be honest, I didn't think I might ever taste this wine again. But, you know, it's one of those wines where you just taste it and it's just like, there's just a, it's just, I mean, for me, this is my own opinion. It's just one person's opinion, but there's just something really special about this wine. I mean, the vintage is already, I mean, you could just tell this vintage is a fantastic vintage, but it's not just your wines. It's a lot of people's wines. But then there's some wines that kind of live in a different orbit. And this was one of the ones that I felt was like that. And Platt is a very famous site for the short history that the Sonoma coast has. So, but this is also a newer site for you in the range. So what is it about this vineyard in this year?
Yeah, so we started in Platt in 16, and we were familiar with it due to, you know, Ray de Couteau and Literai and some of these other guys' bottlings, and had always liked it. We were, I think, to be honest with you, minus Eric's wines at Ray de Couteau a couple times. We were kind of waiting for the big light bulb to go on, but we knew enough about it and liked it enough to definitely pursue it. We started in 16. We were probably the last people to the party that year. So what we made in 16, we didn't really love. So we actually declassified both the Pinot and the Chard into our Sonoma Coast bottlings, which economically doesn't make a lot of sense, but made a lot of sense qualitatively. And then in 17, there was a big shakeout, and there was a block that we'd always coveted, which was Eric's block. And we were the first to sort of stand up and say, yeah, we want that. It's this tiny little block below the vineyard that's all Clariclone. And so we knew we loved that, not just based on the look and the farming, but also for what we tasted out of Eric's wines. And so we jumped in as soon as we could grab it. And 17 and 18 to me have both been amazing. And it's just this incredible combination of density and lightness and color and this ethereal nature. And even in 17, I don't think we knew we had something great until the wine had been bottled for a couple months. And then when we put 18 in tank, all the guys at the winery were like, yeah, this is better than anything we've ever seen come through here. So 19, we made 2.5 barrels, which is a tiny little bit, 60 cases. And with the sort of convergence of all these things happening, we immediately went to the grower and said, hey, we love this. We understand this is a tough economic proposition for you. So just tell us what you want us to pay, and we'll do anything we can to continue. So we've loved this vineyard since 17. And we hope we're going to have a really long future at this site.
And in this vintage 18, it was like 70 cases, as I recall, right?
It was I think it was 120. It was 5 barrels, but it's 1.75 acres.
Okay.
So we're talking about probably, I think that year we got 2.25 tons off of 1.75 acres. And then it was tiny, just over a ton per acre.
Okay. And so the allocations in 19 are you're going to bottle half bottles or what?
Yeah, so as great as the Platt press has been, they're also, so Will Segui is who runs Rivers Marie for me, someone who you know and met and tasted with. Will, as much as people were like, hey, congrats, we love this, we're excited for you, he also got like 10 emails, hey, you didn't offer me a Platt, please remove me from the list immediately, how dare you. But again, a net positive by far, but there were always folks who want to chase wines like that when they get shut out, the feelings get hurt a little bit.
That must be really brutally hard. I mean, look, I hate it when we lose a customer. It really bothers me, to be perfectly honest with you, you know? And so, yeah, I know the feeling. I mean, you know, for people watching, there's maybe in some moments, high scoring wines and whatever, maybe some glamour that is conferred upon the business, but a lot of the companies working in the wine business are small companies where the decision of like one person can really have an impact. And just like, you know, I still read our general email inbox of every single person, you know, who isn't, you know, they can't get into the website, or they have some password issue, or they want to cancel, or they have a positive comment. I mean, all that stuff, like from the most positive to the most negative. And I know it's the same with your business too. And I think there's a lot of businesses that are small. These are still small businesses run by people, you know, and families. They're not, I mean, we've got the conglomerates too, but on this scale, we're talking about artisan stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in small business, so like you said, you as the owner, you want to have your hands on everything. You want to hear from everyone. And you definitely want to hear the negative as well as the positive, because there's a million different ways we can improve upon what we do, whether it be shipping or allocations or winemaking or, I don't know, label design or collateral or outreach or anything. So we want to hear as many things as we can. Anything we don't agree with, we think is a terrible idea, but we're happy to put our hands around everything that we think could improve the business for sure.
Yeah. And so just to wrap up on Platt, for people who don't know, so the Calera clone is from Josh Jensen, and those are rumored to be cuttings that he brought back from Dujac and DRC in the early 70s when he was an intern. And believe it or not, they gave him this wood, which is would never happen today. But that's how the Calera estate was, his, you know, which he sold the Duckhorn. But when Josh planted his original vineyard, Mount Harlan, he planted Dujac and Dujac and DRC clones, and some amalgamation of that. I don't know exact history, but that is what became known as the Calera clone, that then has been propagated to numerous properties like this one. So that may very well be where the origins are. This wine has incredible density and fruit richness.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing which is not that hard to accomplish in certain sites, but the nice part is too, again, like we talked about wines having a certain amount of vine maturity, it has that weightiness without being heavy. Like heavy wines for me aren't anything you go back and grab another glass of or another sip. And this wine doesn't have that. And it's got crazy color, which I think is surprising some people who are cracking bottles early. But again, that's part of the being a super wind buffered site. Really, really thick skins there. So this wine was like a Pinot version of black after one day cold soak.
So just to link together the discussion of Pinots, 3 wines, about a 2-mile difference that separates them. What's the biggest difference between the sites? Is it soil? Is it exposure? Is it clone?
It's probably soil and climate. Like, even though they're very close to each other, like Occidental Ridge, like for anyone who's been out to the town of Occidental, people are trying to identify the true coast, and that goes up and down the entire Sonoma coast. So if you think of Occidental, the actual town, things that are west of the town are being identified as true coast, which would be like Suma and Terriot, things like that. And then just east of town is Ox Ridge. So even though those two vineyards are very close to each other, there's probably a 10-degree temperature difference on a daily basis.
That's remarkable.
Fog, wind, I mean, you name it all. And then Platt is in an area that's very commonly lumped in together with Occidental. It's Freestone. It's where Steve Kissler's Occidental project is as well.
Yeah.
So there's some great stuff coming off the upper elevations of Freestone. And so even though, again, it's really close, you can see the ocean from the vineyard. You get a big fog influence that comes in. You're at 12, 15, 1,600 feet. So you have an elevation element that kicks in as well. So the 3 sites, if you saw them all, you would assume they were in different states. When you drive them sort of place to place to place, you start to realize they're part of one sub-AVA, but they could not be more different from each other.
I mean, I think that's just so cool. We got a ton of questions. Let's take some of these, because this is incredible. Just some wonderful questions from Richard. He says, I opened a bottle of Rivers Marie 2000 Chardonnay Bear Wallow to sip on this webinar, which is a very nice way to spend Monday afternoon. This is my 2nd bottle of what I have. My initial review is rave, and the experience today is the same. It has a collision of different notes on my palate. How does this wine get to this point? Is it the terroir, the winemaking, the vintage? What's the story behind 17? Because that was a really good vintage too.
Well, so I mean, I'm glad that the Bear Wallow thing came up, because this is someone who you're very familiar with, Kevin Harvey at Reese. And Kevin has very nicely offered to sell us fruit from Bear Wallow since 15. We started with Pinot in 15 and Chardonnay in 16. This is all old Wente. I can't remember where Kevin found it. It might be the Hyde selection, but I can't swear to that. And everything that Kevin does is just first class. We like to go to vineyards and point at stuff and ask for people to change things. We go out to Bear Wallow and shrug our shoulders and leave and go have brunch. I mean, there's just nothing really to improve upon given Kevin and his crew. So I think what you're tasting is whatever the deep end of Anderson Valley tastes like, which I think that story is still being written, especially on the higher ends of viticulture. It's going to take folks like Kevin and some other folks who've come out there recently to really push quality, because they can make it make sense economically. And so for me, that wine, I get a really yellow, lemony kind of fruit quality to it. That wine probably had one new barrel on it. So for sure, what you're seeing is true site expression of the deep end of Anderson Valley. But if you pulled, 20 Psalms or whatever and said, what does Anderson Valley Chardonnay taste like? I'm not sure there would be a consensus opinion. So whatever's coming out of these wines, and also Kevin's wines, of course, are sort of people's first look at what potential high-end viticulture is doing to the deep end of Anderson Valley.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I remember tasting the 17s also, and it was a much more complicated vintage, I think. But those wines turned out really beautifully also.
Much more complicated. I mean, Labor Day heat spell in 17 arguably had a bigger impact on the vintage than the fires did, especially when you think about Chard and Pinot, which were probably all picked out by then. And at Bear Wallow, I think we went out, Dan Ricciotto, who's my head vineyard guy, and I went out over Labor Day weekend. And I think it was 100 degrees at Bear Wallow that day.
Yeah, crazy.
It was super warm. Suma, I think I was there the following day. It was 102 at Suma in 2017.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So sticking in Pinot land, Sean asks, outside of the Rivers Marie wines, what are the other Pinots that you make? Pinots and Chards.
So I make, since 11, I've made the Chiboumy Knoll Chardonnay from a really old vine selection in Russian River from Buena Tierra. I make the Boar's View Pinots that project's still owned by Fred Schrader and a partner. And then I also make wines from a vineyard that we call Aston Estate. It's up in Annapolis. It's something that I planted together with some partners in 01. So Boar's View and Aston are both estate wines. Chiboumy's Purchase Fruit, and I'm starting to work with Max Theriot and his two partners on the Senses wines. And these are three guys that are maybe 30 who all grew up in Occidental together, who just have amazing access and great marketing acumen, who are basically just beginning their journey on this Senses project, which is for sure going to be 100% focused on sort of Green Valley, Occidental Freestone area.
Yeah, and one of them is from the Theriot family, and there's a lot of passion there.
Yes, a lot of passion. Max is the Theriot family guy. He's an actor, splits his time between Southern California and here. Chris Streeter is sort of the head of sort of sales marketing. He's sort of the face forward for the brand. And those guys just have a ton of energy. And for me, being a slightly older guy, it's been really fun to watch them sort of interact with new social media style marketing and really get the word out there.
So, one of the questions, I mean, when I go see you, I mean, I don't have a picture, unfortunately, but usually there's like this massive table of wines. We taste a lot of wines. Laith asks, what do you look for when you get asked to do a consulting project?
So I think there's a few things. The ultimate quality is always the leading guide. So whether it be someone who comes to me with an estate piece or someone who says, hey, I've been offered this fruit and I think this is something that could be interesting and we can start here. And then someone who's also patient. I mean, I think what you're finding with projects nowadays, there's no overnight successes. It's kind of a 10-year path, I think, to get a project to where you want it. And so people who think they're just going to make their first vintage and throw it out to review and have 1 million people rush in, whether those days ever even existed, they're definitely gone now. So quality guides it. Patience is part of it. I definitely reserve 51% of the say over everything that happens until the wine makes it into bottle. So I need someone who's going to kind of leave me alone just a little bit. If someone says, hey, I want to make Harlan and they have a vineyard in Coombsville, probably not a good match. So there's a lot of things when you sort of almost interview the owner, you start to realize where these folks are coming from, what their true commitment is, what their true end goal is. And if there's a fit there and quality can also match, then I think it's possible to go forward with someone.
Okay. So, but I'm sure there's a lot of people knocking on the wall, right?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I mean, ever since the Spectator article came out, I think it sort of mildly portrayed me as being way too busy. So I think people have decided not to bother me quite as much. But there's a handful of folks that have come out. I've been doing more kind of true consulting where I'm not the actual winemaker. I'm just helping with protocols, directing styles, blending, things like that. And that's been really fun too, especially bigger wineries to see how that works. You know, we we'll put 1,000 case blend in a tank and be like, whoa, we're exhausted. What a huge day. I can't believe we racked 40 barrels into one wine. And then you go to other places and they're making, 40,000 barrels of a certain wine. So to see these other parts of the wine business for me has been fascinating.
Yeah. There's a question that I think is really interesting. I mean, it's about Pinot Noir for Rivers Marie, but I think it could be extrapolated, which is because you also make Napa wines, and we'll get to those in just a second. But when you make, let's say, Pinot for Rivers Marie, is it the same approach that you use for the other estates, or would we find it, if we were tasting all of your Pinots, would we find a tremendous amount of difference that's not about the place, but more about your approach?
I think you would find the wines are mostly centered on approach. Occasionally there's a style that I can tell a client's reaching for that we're not averse to trying to achieve within a small spectrum. So you have something like Boersview Pinot, for instance, and that's a project that Fred Schrader and a partner of his own. And Fred, I've worked with Fred forever. One of my first ever clients, we started working together in 2000. And I know his style and I know his affinity for things like Marcassin and wines like that are maybe bigger, bolder, richer, denser. And he has a site in Cazadero in the same bowl as Marcassin that actually can achieve that style. So we'll push that a little bit for him. And then other sites, it's probably more directed upon the site and the vintage itself. There's no definite decision. We're not saying, hey, we never pick over 23 or we never pick under 27. It's usually a vintage site specific thing. But I think mostly what helps the wines have their own personalities, we don't do anything to them. I think when people see modern wines, they naturally assume that we're adding a million things to them. And there's a dude in a lab coat somewhere that's like trickling little special powders into the wine or something. But like, for instance, the 318 wines you and I are trying, we remarked about the differences in those wines. All of those wines have had 2 sulfur additions to them. And that's the only thing we did to those wines over the life of those wines. No fining, no filtration, no yeast inoculation, no mallow inoculation, no acid, no water, no enzymes, no powdered tannin, no nothing. I mean, it's a really boring story when you boil it down, but it's a really important story, I think, to help differentiate the wines, in this case, across a single winery's sort of spectrum, but also across clients when you're juggling. I think we have 45 projects now. And if they all tasted the same, someone would just buy a handful of bottles of one project and realize they checked that box.
Yeah. We have a great team, though, working for you. We're working with you. So that's the way that happens. Before we go to Napa, last question on Sonoma, which is from James Johnson, which is how do we resolve the issue with the Sonoma Coast appellation? So for folks who don't know, Sonoma is a little complicated because you have quite a bit of overlap and you have places that can be labeled Russian River. I mean, there's for example, a part of Sonoma where there are certain vineyards that can be either Russian River, Green Valley, or Sonoma Coast for the same exact wine. So this is obviously very complicated for consumers. This question would take a lifetime to answer, but do you have any view on that?
I think it's so big, and I think you're going to have so many people who don't want to participate that it's still going to be more of a winery by winery kind of case. And it's going to be, tasting is going to be believing, I think. Because I think the way that appellation works right now, just because it says Sonoma Coast, I don't think everyone rushes out and thinks it's the most amazing Pinot in California. Same works for Oakville, for Cab, for Napa. So I think it's still going to be tasting is believing, because Sonoma Coast to me is certainly not one appellation. And if there's anything that people are going to do to push that forward is maybe you see Fort Ross Seaview already in the Cazadero area. You might see Annapolis, but I doubt it. There's really not enough people there, and certainly not enough consensus. And then there's been a lot of talk about Occidental Freestone as another kind of sub-AVA. But Occidental is used on, it's a winery name, it's 50 vineyard names. I mean, it's a really messy, convoluted situation. So I think it's going to be about people having faith in certain producers and just sort of subscribing to a single estate's wines.
Yeah, probably. It's very complicated. It's really complicated, especially when the laws are done by the government and there's a resistance to change. There's the other complicated thing is there's a resistance to change things that are already established. So legally, so that's pretty hard. Let's talk about Napa for a second, because there's a bunch of questions on Napa and you've got some really cool sites in that Rivers Marie portfolio. You mentioned Oakville. Laurie is an unbelievably cool, very steep, very rugged, like wild place. And then the latest is Herb Lamb, which is another, like, just sort of, I mean, if you didn't know where it was, you would never be able to get there. It's just sort of, you know, tucked off the side. You know, you're going up to Howell Mountain and you hang a right and basically you're there. And if you keep going, if you pass Jennifer's house, you get to, it used to be Thorovilos, now it's called something that I forget, but it's owned by
Ecotone.
Yeah, Ecotone, exactly. Thanks for reminding me. But it's the old Thorovilos vineyard. So it's a very cool spot in Napa Valley. So Herbland is the latest addition to Rivers Marie. So what is it that attracted you about that site? So that's where Helen Turley made those fantastic wines for Ann Colgan in the mid 90s.
Yeah, I mean that the history of that is a really significant thing, and then the people behind it too. In my case, I never got to know her, but I've gotten to know Jennifer pretty well. There's just very few folks I'd rather work with than her. I mean, there's probably a lot of folks participating in this who've met her or been hosted at her house or have just run into her when they visited Napa. What just an awesome, awesome person. And she just happens to be sitting on an A+ site as well, which is a very nice combination. And so when Herbland came up for lease, I was happy to participate because we bought grapes from there for 2 years. And again, some of this stuff I'm not sure how much I should be saying, but Jennifer, we put
Have a glass of wine, Thomas. You can say it all. It's all good.
There's so many things we could talk about. But Jennifer, I sent her a lease proposal and she very nicely called me and said, well, you know, it's a very nice offer, but I think you could do a little better than this. There's some folks who for sure have done a little better than this. So I appreciated her giving me a second pass at it. And we sweetened the offer a little bit and started a 10-year lease with her in 18. And so the 2018 will bottle in June, and it'll be the first wine that we bottled under the lease agreement. And we're looking forward to sort of a long history there. We've been fans of that vineyard since Fred and Ann, you know, started it with Colgan.
Yeah, and so for folks who don't know, one of the unique aspects about that vineyard, or one of the challenges, is a lot of it is shaded. So there's that middle part that's considered really the best part. And you actually put quite a bit of your Herbland fruit into your straight Napa Valley Cabernet, correct?
Yeah, so in 18, I think it's going to be about a 50-50 split. So there's, historically speaking, you and I were talking about yields. It's 11 or 12 tons, and I would guess 6-ish will make it into the single vineyard designate, and the other 6 tons will go into our Napa appellation wine,
which has a collection of really top vineyards, correct?
Yeah, so it's usually just like Sonoma Coast, Pinot, and Chard. It's usually sort of an amalgam of all the various sites we work with. Like even Laurie, only being 2 acres, there's a couple blocks there that always mildly underperform. So maybe 3 barrels of Laurie will go in, and 15 barrels of Herb Lamb, and there'll be a block of Panic that isn't super successful, or a couple barrels of Larkmead. And those sort of less successful blocks are usually what gets blended into Napa. There's no vineyard that we go out and source to try and create the appellation wine.
Yeah. So another really good question from Leif is, are there any young, who are the young winemakers in Napa Valley that you admire the most right now?
Well, so I think we're seeing a mild pause on some of that right this second, because I think, especially if you want to talk about Napa, it's just gotten so expensive here and the investment is so significant. I think people are having trouble handing projects over to folks who might be slightly unproven, based just solely because of all the money sort of invested in making this thing work. And I think that's unfortunate, because it wasn't the case, 15 or 20 years ago. It was still expensive, but I think people were happy to hire, kind of super seconds at the time. So I think without having sort of a huge leg up, it's been really hard for the next generation to break through. And I'm not sure when that's going to happen. If anything, you see a lot of those folks who certainly deserve that shot are leaving Napa, and they're, maybe to keep it close, they're going to Sonoma. But certainly a lot of people are pursuing things like Paso Robles. A lot of people are going up to Willamette if they're doing Pinot, or Walla Walla if they're doing Cab. So I think what you're going to see is most of the young talent is probably going to leave here, unfortunately, and pursue greater opportunity in other areas.
Really? That's really sad. Because when I spend time in Napa Valley, I'm just amazed always at how many young people are running really important projects. You don't really see that in other parts of the world unless you're from the family,
Yeah, I think there's some folks who are inheriting positions because they were the assistant there, and that's how it should be. Someone takes off. Whenever that happens for us, we always like to sort of hire from within. But I think if someone really wants to strike out on their own, like for instance, their own project and maybe build their own winery and some other stuff. It's just gotten so crazy expensive here to pull off just about anything. Usually that entails people leaving the area and starting some place where the cost of entry is substantially less.
Yeah, because the way that the fruit market works, you're almost obligated to sell your wine direct. And that's really hard beyond more than a couple hundred cases.
Yeah, that's gotten really hard. And I think, people want to, have you believe that everything sells out the moment they release it. And the reality of that is something completely different, unfortunately. And so when you're paying, $25,000 a ton for cab, there's a lot of pressure on DTC sales, and they're just getting harder and harder to capture.
Well, you mentioned something at the beginning. I mean, you mentioned it in passing, but I think it's important for people to understand, which is that there's just a lot more people making really great wine today than in that, when you were going to Calistoga and tasting those great wines as somebody who had just arrived in Napa Valley, it was just a handful of labels. And now there's just a proliferation of fantastic wines, and the younger consumer wants to experiment, and nobody buys a case of anything anymore. Even if it was available, people want to try a bottle of this, a bottle of that. It's really hard to do that, to sell your wine to that kind of a dispersed audience, I think, when there's so many labels making really good wine.
Yeah, I mean, and it would be hard to complain about, the quality coming up in an area, because even though it might seem a little more difficult to sell in the short term, the great long-term benefit is the more great wines an area produces, the more attention the area gets. And so we've been amazed as Rivers Marie's kind of taken hold, or even a few clients, the amount of inquiries we had from kind of all around the world for Napa wines or Sonoma wines, which 10 or 15 years ago, there were distributors in these areas that I'm sure had zero interest in Napa or Sonoma. So even though it makes it tough, domestically for the short term, the more we can sort of produce qualitatively and make the best possible wines that will compete with anything in the world, the better off this industry will be in the long term.
Look, I agree. The number one question I get asked when I'm in London or Bordeaux is, what are the California wines that I should be tasting? What's the newest project? What's the latest thing that's happening? There's an incredible interest in American wines outside the United States. And I think that that's tremendous. And I think it's absolutely necessary to build the next generation of these companies, because you can't just sell it all here. I mean, you can, but the beautiful thing is when you see a bottle of Napa Valley wine next to a First Growth Bordeaux or a Grand Cru Burgundy, because that means that those wines are perceived as being on the same level, I think.
No, absolutely. And also, if you want to keep sort of engendering sales locally, you got to put the wines out there. I mean, if you're a small winery, one of the greatest things about having sort of the 3-tier market at your disposal is you do smart placements, and then people come visit you and buy wines from you, or they exhaust them in their local market and they call you and ask for, a mixed case or whatever. I think that's how it has to be. We did this briefly, and it was the biggest mistake I've ever made. When we pulled everything out of the 3-tier market and put it all to the mailing list, we basically became this sort of unknown thing that existed for 15 years. So when you mention Rivers Marie and the project 12 or 13 or 14 years old, and people are like, yeah, I have no idea what that is, that's a huge mistake for marketing. So I think you have to be in these markets, and ultimately it will do you a tremendous amount of good, not only for your own brand, but for the region as a whole.
Yeah, and that's why you have your appellation wines. Those are the wines that are easier to find through that, where some of it goes through there, right?
Oh yeah, buy the glass wines, cheaper wines by the bottle off the list. I mean, like, the reason that our Sonoma Coast Pinot and Chard are $30 is not because that's what it costs us to make. It's to put the wines out there, have people experience the wine in a restaurant, and then potentially and hopefully call us and say, hey, may I have more? What else do you offer? Can I come visit? We have a winery opening in a couple months for Rivers Marie. Governor Newsom, permitting, we'll actually be able to see people there at some point. And then we want people to come and experience the whole Rivers Marie experience at a hospitality setting, but they probably had Sonoma Coast in a restaurant in New York, and that's where they first heard of us.
Where is that exactly going to be?
So it'll be in Calistoga. It's right next to T-Vine, right on Highway 29.
Yeah.
It's the world's smallest winery, as far as I can tell, but maybe also the world's most expensive winery. But we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, finally.
Well, I know you've been working on that project for a long time, and it was a question that a number of people asked us. We're right up against our time. I know we could talk about a gazillion things. We could talk about all your consulting clients. We could have spent more time on Napa, but hopefully you'll come back sometime and spend some more time with us at cocktail hour. But was really fun to chat with you, Thomas. I'm sorry that usually this time of year I'd bug you to taste 19 barrel samples and you'd be pissed off because you got to organize all these wines of the new vintage, and we can't do that this year. But I will come and bug you again as soon as it's safe and possible.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to, I admit I get a little bit scratchy at times, but it's been long enough where I'm very excited to have people come back out.
Good. Well, I hope you and your family are safe. I hope your team is safe, and cheers. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, of
Thanks
course.
for watching. Thanks for your questions. This will be available for replay on our YouTube and Instagram TV channels. Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.